The courthouse had a pulse of its own, a strange rhythm of papers shuffling, gavel cracks, and echoes of voices caught between marble walls that had seemed too much injustice to still believe in purity. For young attorney Marissa Grant, the sound was both intoxicating and suffocating. It was her first high-profile case, the kind of trial that could either cement her future or leave her reputation shattered. She had prepared for months, pouring every drop of energy into evidence, into testimony, into finding holes in the opposing side's defense. But none of that would matter when Judge Harold Keaton walked into the room. Keaton wasn't just a judge, he was a tyrant robed in black. Lawyers whispered about his temper in hallways, about the way he wielded the bench like a weapon instead of a seat of impartiality. His disdain for young lawyers, especially women, was legendary. To him, they were intruders, too fragile or too naive to handle the gritty theater of justice. And when Marissa stood before him, clutching her notes, he saw not her preparation or fire, but what he wanted to see, an easy target to crush. "Counsel," Keaton drawled on the first day of trial, his voice echoing with false patience, "do you even understand the rules of procedure, or are you here to learn them on my time?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom. It stung, but Marissa lifted her chin. "Yes, Your Honor, and I intend to follow them closely. May I proceed with my witness?" He smirked. "Proceed, though I doubt it will make a difference." Every objection she raised was dismissed without consideration. Every point she made was undercut by his interruptions. The opposing counsel, a smug veteran named Richard Holloway, thrived under Keaton's favoritism, strutting like the courtroom was his stage, as if justice bowed before him. Marissa could feel the eyes on her. Jurors exchanging glances, spectators whispering, her client clenching his fists under the table. She wasn't just fighting the case. She was fighting the man on the bench who had already decided she didn't belong. But Marissa had learned long ago that silence was not survival. Her mother had worked 2 jobs in a town where women weren't supposed to speak up, where opportunities were rationed out like scraps. Her father, a mechanic who died young, had told her once, "The world won't hand you respect, baby girl. You take it, and you make them remember why they gave it to you." Those words burned in her heart as Keaton sneered down at her, mocking every move. On the 3rd day of trial, when she presented a crucial piece of evidence, Keaton slammed his gavel so hard the sound reverberated like a gunshot. "Inadmissible. Counsel, if you attempt to submit irrelevant material again, I will hold you in contempt." "It isn't irrelevant," Marissa fired back before she could stop herself. The room froze. Even Richard Holloway's smirk faltered. Keaton leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" She steadied her voice. "The evidence directly supports my client's defense. It isn't irrelevant, it's inconvenient. There's a difference, Your Honor." The air was thick with shock. Nobody talked to Keaton like that. Nobody dared. But Marissa had crossed the invisible line, and she knew the consequences before the words had even left her lips. "Bailiff," Keaton thundered, his voice trembling with fury, "escort Ms. Grant from this courtroom. She is in contempt." The clank of handcuffs echoed in her ears as the bailiff approached, but her client jumped up, shouting, "This is corruption! She's the only one fighting for me!" The courtroom dissolved into chaos. Jurors murmuring, reporters scribbling furiously, spectators gasping. By evening, news of the spectacle had spread beyond the courthouse walls. Headlines swirled, "Young lawyer dragged from courtroom by furious judge." Television anchors replayed the footage on loop. Some mocked her for overstepping, others hailed her as brave. But Marissa sat in her apartment that night, hands trembling, wondering if her career was over before it had even begun. She could have stopped there. She could have accepted that the system was bigger than her, that Keaton was untouchable. But something inside her refused to die.
Maybe it was rage, maybe pride, maybe justice itself speaking through her veins. But she made a decision that night. If the judge had tried to silence her, then she would rise louder. If he had tried to bury her, she would claw her way back to the surface, and not as a lawyer this time, but as something greater. Marissa's path from humiliation to vengeance was not quick. It took years of grit, strategy, and sacrifice. She appealed Keaton's contempt ruling and won, exposing his bias in legal journals. She built her name case by case, representing clients no one else would touch, the discarded and the voiceless. And with each victory, whispers about her grew louder. She wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was a force. Meanwhile, Keaton's arrogance metastasized. He ruled recklessly, protected his allies, and silenced anyone who questioned him. Complaints piled up in secret, but his old political connections shielded him. Still, cracks were forming, tiny fractures in the marble facade he had built, and Marissa knew how to exploit them. One fateful day, years later, the courtroom doors opened again. But this time, Marissa wasn't standing at the defense table. She wasn't carrying notes or clutching evidence. She was walking to the bench, a robe draped across her shoulders, her name carved into the plaque that read, Judge Marissa Grant. The room buzzed as she took her seat for the first time. The weight of the gavel in her hand was heavy, but it wasn't a weapon. It was a reminder of the journey, of the fight she had endured. And when the bailiff called the next case, Marissa's breath caught in her chest. The defendant's lawyer rose, and there he was, Richard Holloway, older but still smug, and standing behind him, advising in the shadows, was none other than Harold Keaton, now retired, but still circling the system like a vulture. The universe had delivered her vengeance to her doorstep, wrapped in irony. The man who once silenced her would now have to plead before her, and the courtroom, that unforgiving stage, would finally witness the twist it had never seen coming.
The silence in the courtroom was different now. It wasn't the silence of fear or the kind that followed Keaton's gavel when he demanded obedience. It was a silence laced with recognition, with whispers of poetic justice running through the air. The reporters in the gallery leaned forward, their pens twitching. Jurors straightened in their chairs. And Harold Keaton, once untouchable, once the king of this stage, shifted uncomfortably in the back, cloaked not in a robe, but in the plainness of a man who had lost his throne. Marissa met his eyes only briefly. It was enough. The years had not been kind to him. His face had sagged, his arrogance dimmed, though the bitterness still clung to him like a shadow. For a moment, she thought she saw fear flicker across his expression. Then it hardened, as if he realized where he was and who he had once been. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Marissa lifted the gavel. The wood was smooth against her palm, polished from countless strikes. She remembered the sound it had made when Keaton had slammed it against her, how it had echoed like a verdict against her worth. But today, the gavel was hers. She struck it firmly, and the sound rang through the room like thunder. The case before her was simple on paper. A fraud trial, accusations of financial misconduct, a defense built on procedural loopholes. But beneath the paperwork, Marissa saw the rot. Holloway, the same man who had once laughed at her struggles, was now defending a corporate giant accused of bleeding communities dry. And whispering strategy into his ear was Keaton, who had been consulting since his retirement, maneuvering from the shadows, still drunk on the power he once wielded openly. Holloway rose with a swagger that time hadn't beaten out of him. "Your Honor," he said with a smirk, "I trust this court will proceed fairly without unnecessary dramatics." The words weren't just a jab. They were a memory pulled from the past, a reminder of how they had once cornered her, mocked her, dismissed her as nothing. But Marissa had learned long ago that revenge wasn't about fire or fury. It was about patience, about striking in silence with precision. "You'll find this court very fair, Mr. Holloway," she said evenly, her voice calm but edged with steel. "But fairness demands truth, and truth has no patience for theatrics." The trial unfolded, but this time the scales did not tilt under the weight of a corrupt gavel. When Holloway tried to bury her in objections, she dismantled them with calm precision, citing precedents he hadn't expected her to know. When he attempted to sway the jury with grand speeches, she cut them through with surgical rulings that forced the evidence into the light. Every time Keaton leaned forward to whisper in his ear, she caught it, pausing the proceedings just long enough for the jury to notice, for the spectators to murmur. Slowly, she pulled back the curtain on their scheme, not just the fraud of the defendant, but the moral bankruptcy of the men guiding the defense. By the second week of trial, the tension was unbearable. The defendant was crumbling, the jury restless, the press ravenous. And then came the moment Marissa had been waiting for, the point where the law itself demanded exposure. A key witness testified that Keaton had helped draft fraudulent documents years earlier, back when he was still sitting on the bench. The revelation sent a shockwave through the room. Gasps echoed. Reporters' pens scratched like fire. Holloway's face turned gray, his confidence evaporating. Keaton stood, his voice breaking through the murmurs. "This is absurd. I'm not on trial here. You cannot slander me in this courtroom." Marissa leaned forward, her gaze fixed on him. "Mr. Keaton, you are not above scrutiny. You are not shielded by that robe anymore. This courtroom belongs to justice, not to your ego. Sit down, or I will have you removed." The crowd erupted, whispers, gasps, even a few cheers, quickly silenced by the bailiff's demand for order. For the first time, Keaton had no gavel to silence the storm. For the first time, he was the one trembling under the authority. The trial ended with a conviction. The defendant was found guilty, and Holloway left broken, his career stained by association. But the greater sentence had been passed silently in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the trial. The image of Harold Keaton being silenced in the very courtroom where he had once reigned would live forever. After the verdict, Marissa sat in her chambers alone. She removed her robe, folding it carefully on her desk. Outside, she could still hear the murmurs, the disbelief of those who had witnessed the downfall of a man once thought untouchable. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, remembering the days she had been dragged out in handcuffs, the shame, the rage, the despair. Now the scales had shifted. She hadn't needed to scream, to curse, or to destroy him with fire. She had destroyed him with the one thing he thought he owned, the law. Years later, people would tell the story in hushed tones. They would tell that a young lawyer once defied a tyrant judge, that he tried to silence her, humiliate her, bury her career. And they would tell how she rose, brick by brick, until she sat where he once sat, wielding the gavel with fairness instead of fear. They would say the courtroom itself remembered, that the marble walls still whispered of the day justice turned on its master. But for Marissa, it was simpler. She hadn't become a judge to punish him, though fate had delivered that satisfaction. She had become a judge to ensure no one else would suffer the way she had, silenced under the weight of arrogance and corruption. The last time she saw Keaton was months later, outside the courthouse. He looked smaller than she remembered, shoulders hunched, his face weathered not just by age but by disgrace. He paused when he saw her, and for a moment their eyes locked. There were no words, no apologies, no gavel to strike. Just the quiet acknowledgement that the roles had reversed, permanently. Marissa walked past him, head held high. She didn't need revenge anymore. She was the embodiment of it. And with every step echoing on the marble steps, she knew she had carved her place not only in the courthouse, but in the very history of justice.